The 2026 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of California, the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation, the Waters Living Trust, and Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. With university sponsors, Pepperdine University, the University of Geneva, the Graduate Theological Union, the Catholic University of Leuven, and the Catholic University of Lyon. And community partners, the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris, the Chemin Neuf Community in France, Emmanuel Episcopal Church of Geneva, the Center for Liberation Theologies at the Catholic University of Leuven, and the French-speaking Institute of Systematic Theology and Ethics at the University of Geneva. With the 2026 hotel partner, Nest M Gallery, Paris La Défense, an Accor luxury hotel. And special thanks to the following: Dr. Christophe Chalamet, Dr. Estelle Sogbou, Dr. Judith Gruber, Dr. Dara Straub, Kim Powell, Dr. Anne-Marie Reinen, Dr. Raymond Carr, Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, and Colette Rogers Grizzell.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
So my talk today will be a little bit more discursive.
Ce serait un peu plus discursif.
In the sense of being historical rather than getting into the inner material content of the theology.
Ce serait davantage historique que d'entrer vraiment dans des questions théologiques.
Yeah, because I feel you need to have a little bit more context for how it developed.
Je crois que vous avez vraiment besoin d'avoir le contexte pour voir comment est-ce que les choses se sont développées.
And as I turn to my paper, I want you to know that this is online free. It's free online.
Ce livre est en ligne et accessible pour tous.
Yeah. I wrote this in 2020.
Je l'ai écrit
while teaching at Harvard. These three books are follow-up to the Karl Barth and James Cone. So Karl Barth wrote on Mozart.
Et ce livre est la suite de Karl Barth avec Mozart, le livre que je vous ai fait passer.
In fact, on the day that he died, his wife had walked in the room to put Mozart on and found him dead.
Et le jour où Karl Barth est décédé, sa femme est rentrée dans la pièce et elle voulait lui jouer du Mozart et elle s'est rendue compte qu'il était déjà mort.
And James Cone wrote on the spirituals and the blues.
Et James Cone a écrit l'ouvrage The Spiritual and the Blues,
building on Karl Barth,
qui est en partant aussi de Karl Barth.
My three volumes,
donc il y a 3 volumes,
move Barth and Cone forward.
Qui essaient de mettre en avant Karl Barth et James Cone.
The Barth that critiqued Hitler,
le Barth qui a critiqué Hitler,
and the Cone that critiqued white racism.
Et James Cone qui critique du coup tout le racisme.
All right, so I'm going to read the paper.
Donc voilà, je vais lire le papier. Vous avez vraiment la traduction. Si quelqu'un est un peu perdu, juste levez la main et puis je vous dirai où on est.
Title of the paper is Theology and the Mode of Monk. Oh, and one thing, I'm just let you hear a little bit, since you can't translate it, a little bit of Thelonious Monk, so you can watch.
Je vous ferai écouter un tout petit bout de Thelonious Monk.
And see him at work.
Comme vous pourrez le voir, comment il fonctionne et qu'est-ce qu'il fait.
His melodies were beautiful. His chords were unusual. His colors, his rhythmic sense, and the spiritual feeling in the music. When you heard his music, it just carried you away.
difficult thing about Monk in the studio was a combination of his perfectionism and his really basic, I think, inability to understand what the hell was supposed to be so difficult about his music. You know, the attitude that he understood it, why couldn't you?
There's a lot of things that we do in common one to another. And we all do some of the usual things. We use some of the usual phrases. Monk wasn't like that. You know. So Monk was like a real free spirit who said, I'm gonna play this way. This is what I want. And he played stuff that nobody else ever played. Spirit. I'm probably one of the few people who really stuck to their gun and got what he wanted out of what he wanted to do. You know, there's very few people who make it doing what they want to do. Monk went through a period of not making it, but he still was Monk. When he made it, he still was Monk.
He epitomizes what a jazz musician is supposed to be. He has a style which is instantly identifiable, whether it's in composition, whether it's in his playing, or whether it's someone playing along the lines of Thelonious Monk. It's a very personal approach to jazz.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin. I'm going to read the paper, and I'll come back to this idea of Monk being heard in any kind of circumstance because of the uniqueness of how he plays.
Je reviendrai souvent sur cette figure de Monk pour voir comment il joue et comment il procède.
Theology and the Mode of Monk toward an aesthetic of Black liberation. Here at the beginning, allow me to express my appreciation to the Catholic University of Lyon for allowing me to share this space with you today. I hope that it is the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship, not simply with the King Center, but as colleagues and future theologians who think through faith together. I've learned much from Catholic thinkers. Rosemary Radford Ruther, M. Sean Copeland, a womanist theologian. Herbert Mullin has helped me with my emphasis in the Holy Spirit, on the Holy Spirit or pneumatology. David Tracy, Hans Urs von Balthasar, the mysticism of Julian of Norwich, and the ever-present Trappist monk, Thomas Merton, a Catholic whose hermeneutical orientation has served me quite well. As you know, many of these scholars have departed to be with God, so there is a sense in wrestling with them that we come to terms with the past. The same can be said about many of the jazz artists or literary figures with whom I engage. Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and many others have departed the earth. Thus, my relationship with theology or jazz or literature is not determined ultimately by the immediate relevance of these various thinkers. They were addressing different situations, different times, and different places. Our ultimate relevance is determined by something deeper, richer than time and space itself. When I think of the African American traditions of the diaspora, or the African tradition of the diaspora, I'm reminded of a quote by Karl Barth that reiterates a message I know from my ancestors, especially if they are heard as living voices who speak to us, yes, even today. Barth wrote about this in one of his oft-ignored books where he discusses living voices. I quote, and I'm going to add something to this. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Schleiermacher, I'm going to add James Cone, and Dolores Williams, and Toni Morrison, and Thelonious Monk, and all the rest are not dead, but living. They still speak and demand a hearing as living voice, as surely as we know that they and we belong together in the church. We cannot play our part today without allowing them to play theirs. Our responsibility is not only to God, to ourselves, to the men and women of today, to other living theologians, but to them. I find great comfort in this approach, which has deepened my insights into the terms of communion with the ancestors. And as I've reflected upon the work of Charles H. Long and James Noel, one of my dear friends who was my teacher, especially in the last day or so, this sense of communion has become even more poignant. I find myself arguing with many of them, hearing their encouraging and chastising words again. It is in this light that I want to share a little with you of how theology in the mode of monk developed out of my own autobiography. I will first state a brief intellectual background of how Karl Barth and James Cone came to be the center of my work, and then shift to why the music of Thelonious Monk emerged as a central medium in order to negotiate an aesthetics that takes seriously what might be called extra-church realities. I want you to underline that if you have it in your paper. Extra-church realities, such as Cone's secular spirituals or Barth's secular parables. And I will close with a brief ode or a brief look at how Monk's jazz draws on Barth's Mozart, articulating a truth about the luminous darkness that has led me toward an African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension. My theological biography. This is my story, this is my song. First, I would be remiss if I failed to mention the communal sensibility the three of us share together. We're all graduates of the GTU. Our being here and our being together was not planned. By contrast, I arrived at the GTU, which is Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, in 2003 with ambitions to join a theological group called the Black Theology Forum, or BT Forum, that was started by Will Coleman, a black theologian who focuses more on African traditions. I read about this group of second generation black scholars in a book called Cut Loose Your Stammering Tongue. It was edited by Dwight Hopkins, the first student assistant to James Cone. I had to discipline my disappointment when I learned that the BT Forum no longer existed. In response to this news, I branded myself as the last remaining member of the now defunct BT Forum. Now, the BT Forum included Dwight Hopkins, George Cummings, Will Coleman, and James Noel, who was my teacher. Each one developed black theology and black religion with respect to different taxonomies and different directions. George Cummings engaged Latin American liberation theology. Will Coleman embodied black tribal traditions. And Dwight Hopkins closely followed James Cone, the father of Black Liberation Theology. However, he used more of an ethnographic methodology to explore black theological traditions. By contrast, James Noel, my teacher and advisor, followed Charles H. Long. You see that book that's coming around that's called Signification. Expanding the history of the religious tradition, of religions and that tradition. Exploring, re-articulating, and sharpening Long's critique of James Cone. This placed me in a somewhat awkward situation since I arrived with plans to bring together Karl Barth and James Cone. The Womanist tradition represents another direction or taxonomy in relation to black theology. Womanist progressions, to use a musical term, developed in an independent direction, and no womanist was a part of this initial group at the GTU. My question, nevertheless, became, how would I understand and articulate myself in relationship to this larger tradition and with its various directions? It's sort of like your question. How you come to that? And there's a sense in which that came to me. I often say to people, I often say to my friends, I did not discover Monk. Monk discovered me. And the reason I say that, they got that? Is because Monk helped me to find myself within this space. So Barth once said that sometimes an idea would press itself upon you. And that's often that idea in some way calling you to come to it. Something to think about. Let me continue. Something else that evolved in my thought is my recognition of these differences as counter melodies or counterpoints, which in music allows room for these differences to coexist, being heard in complementarity rather than radically opposed to each other. Thus, being theologically interested in the work of Karl Barth and existentially tied to the work of James Cone, I decided to develop my theology in the direction behind Cone, in order to excavate and explicate how he had appropriated from the theology of Karl Barth in the first place. In other words, I wanted to go back to the future, especially since none of the previous theologians had written a dissertation that journeyed behind Cone to appraise where he had derived his ideas. Indeed, and to this day, only 2 dissertations have been written on Karl Barth and James Cone, and very few books on Cone. Beverly Eileen Mitchell, who addresses a more transatlantic conversation, and my own dissertation. To give a little insight into the problem, Oxford and Cambridge just recently, and this is where I met my dear sister Estelle, they recently, relatively speaking, had the first conference ever addressing the theologies of Karl Barth and James Cone in 2022. The symposium was called Karl Barth and James Cone, Theology in Context. This fact says something about the overall reception of James Cone's black theology and perhaps the way academic agendas have shaped the development of black theology. I call it the academic industrial complex. You can read about it in book 3. Okay? Theology at the Crossroads is the next section. Charles H. Long and the impossibility of doing theology. The theological line and direction that I pursued is more organically tied to the background and thinking of Charles H. Long, the historian of religion. This locates me more directly with James Noel, my former teacher. Ironically, Long's position strikes at the heart of the whole theological enterprise. Long raises questions that altogether challenge the veracity and possibility of theology. Is theology possible? That's the question. In fact, Long writes that theology is opaque, and with this term opaque, he's describing any kind of liberation theology, must become deconstructive theologies, that is to say, theologies that undertake the destruction of theology as a powerful mode of discourse. I want you to catch that. He would say that sometimes in another way. He said, a theology of freedom is first a critique of theology as a powerful mode of discourse. Let me keep reading. James Noel extends and elaborates Long's insight, writing that black theologians superimpose theological categories generated by white European and American theologians onto black religious experience. Consequently, if theology fails to do justice to the depth, diversity, complexity, and richness of the actuality of black religion, it said, consequently, it fails to do justice. I read that a little off there, all right? It fails to do justice to that complexity. Let me keep moving. Hence, the first question I had to quickly learn is a subtle one. The word deconstruction is not radically negative. It is a deconstruction of the power that resides within the categories themselves. Said differently, Long is arguing that we must develop theology so as not to normalize the categories in ways that overdetermine black life. He is not saying theology is an impossibility. Thus, read in light of Noel's and Long's critique, to use a quote from Barth, the challenge to do theology for me becomes an impossible possibility. It's kind of a paradox, an impossible possibility. Because with God, things are possible. But let me keep reading. It is at this point where the music of Thelonious Monk contributes as a medium and a cultural idiom or language to provide a methodology for me to engage in a theology that is parabolically suggestive. Catch that language of parabolic, okay? Functioning in both a self-critical, deconstructive, and a simultaneously constructive mode of thinking, i.e. Aufhebung. That's a German word, which means what you critique something and you lift it up. But in Barth's Dogmatics, it's translated as simply an abolition of religion. That's a bad translation. It's a double meaning. Critique religion and you lift it up. Let me keep reading. In other words, through Monk's musical aesthetics, I established a theological framework that is self-critical, avoiding the trap related to Cone's emphasis on subjectivity, and affirming of humanity, avoiding the trap related to Barth's emphasis on objectivity at the same time. This framework allows me to think using an aesthetic mode of religious apprehension that emerges from black life. So when jazz enthusiasts ask me, why Monk? They're asking one question, but theologians should be thinking about another. Allow me to explain. So why Thelonious Monk? Asked the jazz enthusiast. What does theological thinking have to do with Thelonious Monk? And what does Monk have to do with theology? What the enthusiast really is asking is, why did I choose Monk over John Coltrane's Love Supreme? Or Bud Powell's virtuosic digital approach to jazz? And why not one of the other beboppers, such as Charlie Bird Parker or Dizzy Gillespie? Why Monk? And I explained there are many reasons for this, and I will quickly identify a few of those reasons for you today. First, personally, no one style, as the video has said, is as distinctive as Thelonious Monk's style. His audacity in terms of his self-expression is arguably unparalleled. He is fearless. I think of that word, parrhesia, to go your own way when you don't even know sometimes where you're going or how you're going to get there. Boldness, fearless, parrhesia. Let me keep reading. As Billy Taylor, the dean of jazz, says in the video you watch, Monk epitomizes what you expect in a jazz artist. His style is instantly recognizable, whether in composition, as being played by Monk, or played by someone else. How I'm doing with time?
No, 10 minutes.
I got 10 minutes in?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to keep working. All right. It is this idiosyncratic aspect of Monk's music that parabolically reminds me that a theology, which primarily emerges from below in black traditions, needs something akin to a numerological Christology to address the charisms in the traditions, the gifts of the black church, the black folk traditions, and the black experience. Notice that numerological Christology. It honors the den of life with its angularities, rhythmic displacements, and concrete cultural contingencies that mark a distinctive black style of life. This distinctiveness affirms our peculiar humanity. God is speaking to us and from us, even outside the walls of the church. This kind of theology follows the advice of the Catholic Womanist theologian, M. Sean Copeland, who suggests that theology must go down to the crossroads. She says this: when a theology goes down to the crossroads, it risks encounter with new wisdom found at the heart of black vernacular culture. Here, theology must sit beside and listen to children, women, and men who live in the shadow of poverty and want and fear. Here, theology takes on the mark of invisibility, the visible racial mark. Here, theology becomes black and Catholic. Stay with me. James Cone articulates this importance in an even more strict way. He emphasizes existential and subjective insights when describing, for example, The Spirituals and the Blues, a book that I just passed around. I want to get it back too. Make sure that book makes it back. A book of representing the most important term, one of the most important terms in black theology. Cone writes the following: existentially, the subject matter and focus of this book have been defined by the black musical forms which have influenced my life. I've written about the spirituals and the blues because I've lived the experience which created them. I affirm the reality of the spirituals and the blues as an authentic expression of my humanity, responding to them in rhythms of dance. I therefore write about the spirituals and the blues because, catch this part, because I am the blues and my life is a spiritual. Without them, I cannot be. I think Cone is doing pneumatology in this book. Pneumatology always comes through experience. His word spiritual has a deep context to it. Let me keep reading. When theology witnesses to the gospel in such cultural mode, it honors what Charles Long calls the datum of black experience, and it disrupts the cultural power motifs in the history of Western Christianity in the same way the nocturnal styles of jazz artists disrupt the circadian rhythms of the normal person's body clock. I understand that because right now I'm in jet lag, and I feel like a jazz artist. Often for these others, it is round midnight when the jazz woman or jazz man comes alive. She or he is metaphorically reconciled to the midnight in the social order. Thus, the midnight in the social order does not necessarily have to be understood negatively. It can become the grounds for a new beginning to embrace the light, illuminating the way through what Aretha Franklin called the spirit in the dark. Monk's musical aesthetic then, like the Cone spirituals and the blues, or Monk's jazz, or Aretha Franklin's soul, represents a subjective turn beyond Bart's so-called objective Mozart. We will describe a little more later below of this Bart's objective Mozart. Even Monk's gradual movement away from religion in his own life implicitly raises the question of Christendom's relevance. That is, questions about its structures, its ideologies, and the cultic acts and the methodologies of religion. I can't believe we have libraries today without James Cone in the libraries. Look around. Whose books are in your library? Who's determining which books are in your library? Let me get back to the paper. This becomes an ever-present reminder to the listening theologian that in the black aesthetic mode of apprehension, the church, quote, has never considered creedal formulations normative for salvation. It was a spirit, sometimes in the darkness of the hush harbor or invisible institution, that brought liberation. Now, this is very important, folks. I can't tell you how important this is. I'm suspicious of the way churches, and look, and by the way, I know you're Catholic, all right? So I haven't come to insult you. But I'm always suspicious of Catholic. You need to quote me on this, so make sure you translate for me. Really quickly. I'm very suspicious.
Je suis un peu suspicieux.
How sacraments are deployed.
Combien de sacrements on doit vraiment développer.
Especially when black people were not baptized.
Et plus particulièrement quand les personnes noires ne sont pas baptisées.
Because baptizing them would have made people think they were free.
Et dans le contexte africain-américain, le fait de les baptiser, c'était aussi de leur faire croire qu'ils étaient libres.
And I'm going to say this really quick and get back to the paper.
Je le dis rapidement.
And I'm very suspicious of the fact.
Mais je remets vraiment en question ces.
There's only about 350 black Catholic bishops in America.
On n'a pas assez de 300? No.
About 350.
Rien.
You can double check later online, okay?
On n'a pas assez d'évêques africains-américains.
Does God like black people? Let me
La
keep reading.
question, est-ce que Dieu aime les personnes noires?
All right, thank you.
Donc la question reste ouverte.
Still, Monk's approach to jazz does not simply glory in the subjective. In fact, Monk's name is synonymous with the signification of a turn, a joyful turn in and beyond jazz tradition itself. As Gabriel Solis, the music critic, points out, Monk's name is often invoked in relationship to countercultural hipness or nonconformism, perhaps even deconstructionism. Monk influenced poets and artists, theologians, and many others. Even a routine Google search reveals the Thelonious Monk of bass, the Thelonious Monk of actors, the Thelonious Monk of DJs, the Thelonious Monk of streetwear, of poetry, even the Thelonious Monk of therapy. I always wonder what that's about. If Donald Trump were inclusive, if Trump were inclusive, he may call himself the Thelonious Monk of presidents. But that truth is that he would rather be called King Trump. But I digress. Let me move. All right. Even during the revolutionary period of the 1940s when bebop emerged, Monk played his music in such a singular way that it was described as a revolution within a revolution. Stay with me here. And Monk was described as a bebopper who never played bebop. His music was so revolutionary that it critiqued the revolution that he was a part of. Hannah Arendt said, revolutions devour their children. But take note, for when there is a revolution within a revolution, it gestures to something beyond human revolution. In this case, I want to suggest that it gestures toward God's revolution, which revolutionizes human revolutions. All things have become new. What is Paul talking about? All things are new? Really? Anyway. The point I'm suggesting about Monk's music and objectivity is that it becomes such a singular example of influence that it can be identified in much the same way that Karl Barth identifies Mozart with that objectivity. And I don't need to have Barth doing Mozart to show you this. It's just a fact. Indeed, Barth suggests that Mozart was a peculiar secular parable, speaking outside the walls of the church, extramuros ecclesia. In his liturgical sense, he believed Mozart could hear the yes of God's covenant, the divine melody, or what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the cantus firmus, illuminating through the whole polyphony of creation. If Bonhoeffer is correct, and I think he is, when he asserts that, quote, where the cantus firmus is clear and plain, the counterpoint can be developed to its limits. This objective insight is part of what Barth discovered in Mozart. Barth could hear the cantus firmus, the divine melody, radiating and sounding in everything that is good and true and beautiful. That's a little Balthasar there. In all of the world's silences, its contingencies. Listen to Karl Barth's objective view of Mozart. Now I'm going to skip through this because we're getting to the end here, and I want to make sure I save room for my colleagues. He says, and I'm in the second paragraph there, the second quote, I'm going to go right out where it says, elsewhere he writes, can one ever listen enough to what happens in Mozart's orchestra? How the components are introduced, unexpected but always with perfect timing, in their own height or depth and tone and color. It is as though in a small segment, the whole universe bursts into song. Because evidently the man Mozart has apprehended the cosmos and now functioning only as a medium, brings it into song. Truly, we can call this incomparable. In fact, Barth suggested that the Catholic Church needed to in some way make a saint out of Mozart, but that's between you all and Mozart. All right, the truth of the modern world, however, the truth about the modern world, however, is that it does not often acknowledge the truth about itself. It does not want to embrace the fact that it is a world of materiality, and therefore it overlooks its possibilities. It overlooks what Mozart and Monk, who also played his music on the cantus firmus, heard. It ignores its imperfections, its contingencies. It minimizes what it means to live in a world of flesh and blood, a world which contains angularities, dissonances, deformations, contradictions, and concrete limitations. From the very beginning of creation. I'm talking Genesis, if we're listening to Genesis. It is a world with silences and evils and abominations from the beginning. It is a world of chance and contingency. Heard from this vantage, Monk's musical idiom, including the so-called wrong notes he played, the scrap notes and the chords and others, like Mozart, these chords and others who, like Mozart, that Mozart did not play, those that were enacted in Monk's own veering and gyring and utterly unique sense of rhythm, is analogous to the absurdity of the cross and God's identification with a broken world. To find hope is to live in the midst of this world as it is, but with what Cone might call an ironic tenacity coming from the blues. To find hope leads one to not only ask what dissonance means to harmony or what it means to melody, but what silence means to sound and what darkness means to light. It is here in the luminous darkness that pneumatology takes the lead in relation to Christology. To be sure, I think Monk's music might be speaking an even deeper subjective word to our objective truths about ourselves. And what is needed is not the reification of more categories, languages, or theologies. What is needed are ears to hear the moan and the shout, and the melodies and counter melodies that all belong together in a strange sounding way. Now I'm going to skip down to the very end of this paper. So again, I want my colleagues to have time. And you can read the rest at another time. I'm moving where it says toward the theology of spiritual freedom.
Vers une théologie de la liberté spirituelle.
Yeah, that's on page 11. And this is the close. If Barth and Cone are to contribute to spiritual freedom, it is helpful to acknowledge the pneumatological impulse as being made up of other impulses, including historical, philosophical, and socio-political. Spiritual freedom can be uniquely conditioned from various theologies, including Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, liberationist, queer, feminist, womanist, and black theologies. Truth, in fact, emerges from the various traditions, like melodies and counter-melodies. And when read charitably, our unity bears the wisdom and insight of our differences. It is reflective of the particular socio-political systems from which it comes. Indeed, every distinction is important, provided our distinctions are not reduced to an arbitrary system or syncretism. Here, Barth is correct when in dialogue with American theologians in 1962, he states that, quote, systematization is always the enemy of true theology, close quote. He goes on to suggest that when one point in theology is made the center of all others, theology can become immodest and unjust. It can lose its cadences. It no longer functions as a joyful silence, a luminous darkness, or a midnight dance, for it no longer has ears to hear the spirit in the dark that leads us in the dance toward black liberation. I close with a song from the Catholic tradition, and sort of like this, the lyrics are, Jesus, he must dance the lead, and the Virgin Mary. All must pay his rhythm heed to reach God's sanctuary. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you very much, Dr. Raymond.
My pleasure.
Also, thank you for your rhythm, the way that you get us through with all your... You make us feel how monks would have done their theology, and we all want to do like monks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Donc, merci à toi. I will tell that in French, even though that you not really get all the things that. Merci de la manière dont tu nous as conduits à travers cette théologie à la manière de Monk, c'est-à-dire Monk qui est musicien, jazziste, avec beaucoup aussi d'interruptions de manière assez disruptive, et que notre théologie est appelée aussi à être un peu disruptive. Donc, il est 40, donc 5 minutes pour voir si vous avez juste des questions de compréhension à partir de cet exposé. Est-ce qu'il y a des choses que vous voulez maintenant comprendre, interroger, avant qu'on entende à nouveau un autre keynote speaker, et puis pour continuer dans ce que nous a partagé Raymond. I will open just for question, just some understanding question.
While we wait?
Yes.
Okay, no problem.
Quelque chose qui vous a interpellé, même choqué à l'oreille, ou there's one there, I presume.
Really grateful to hear this talk, because it's the first time I hear really the link with music and theology. So is it also unique in the US to have these links? Because I'm not used to this. I'm really interested in.
No, I talk about this in my book. There are a number of people who've been talking about theology and biblical studies and all this for decades, right? So again, this is the reason why, and you want to quote me on this? This is the reason why I think it's important that European theologians and even American theologians hear what I call the black charismata. Comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Could you tell them that?
Yeah. Pour ceux qui ont compris, donc, Dr. Raymond Carr signalait déjà qu'il y a beaucoup d'autres théologiens avant lui qui ont fait le lien entre la théologie et la musique, ou la Bible et la musique, mais il y a vraiment quelque chose de particulier dans cette manière de faire qu'il nous propose, qu'est-ce qu'il appelle le charisme noir.
Yeah. The black church and the black experience is a gift.
Donc, l'expérience noire et les églises noires sont un don.
In fact, when Karl Barth went to Göttingen, which was his first teaching job.
Donc, la première fois où Karl Barth est allé à Göttingen,
Germany. Because he was from Basel. He goes to Göttingen.
Oui, c'est ça. Quand il allait enseigner en Allemagne, dans le premier poste qu'il a eu.
Yeah, it's a Lutheran school.
C'était une école luthérienne.
And he gets a letter from a German pastor.
Donc il reçoit une lettre d'un pasteur allemand.
Who says he's happy that Barth is going to Göttingen because the Lutherans need to hear the Reformed charismata.
Donc il était heureux qu'il y ait un théologien plutôt réformé, Karl Barth étant de la tradition réformée, pour enseigner à des luthériens, pour qu'ils apprennent aussi de ce charisme réformé.
And if white American theologians won't hear the black charismata,
et est-ce que les théologiens blancs voudront aussi accueillir le charisme noir?
The German theologians should, or the European theologians should. Because just like you heard jazz first, before some of the Americans, you can also hear the black charismata in the church.
Donc les théologiens européens en ont aussi besoin, de la même manière que nous avons commencé par écouter le jazz au début de notre session. La même manière aussi, il y a à reprendre ou à accueillir le charisme noir.
That's why I'm here.
Et c'est pour ça que je suis là. Encore une autre question pour Raymond Carr, et puis
j'ai lu dans le document, pas écouté vraiment,
I read in the handout
que la systématisation est toujours l'ennemi de la vraie théologie.
that the quote of Karl Barth, that systematization is always hidden.
Et nous savons quand même que la philosophie est fille de la théologie.
We know that philosophy is the doctor of theology.
Mais si on prend cette systématisation, est-ce que nous devons faire de la théologie comme on fait la philosophie?
Should we do theology the same way that we do philosophy? We learn,
No.
we practice.
I think there are two different disciplines.
Ce sont deux disciplines très différentes,
Right? But they're related.
mais elles sont reliées.
Yeah. They have two different.
Au départ, très différentes.
Right? Theology, we can even raise questions about whether it has an epistemology, like philosophy.
Et en théologie, on peut aussi poser la question épistémologique.
But philosophy can use music.
Mais la philosophie peut aussi utiliser la musique.
And when Karl Barth was asked about philosophy,
Et quand on interrogeait Karl Barth sur la philosophie,
because he was often criticized for not using philosophy,
parce qu'il était souvent critiqué de ne pas utiliser suffisamment la philosophie,
people asked him, what does he do?
les gens se demandaient, mais qu'est-ce qu'il fait?
He said, I use it.
Il dit, mais si, j'utilise la philosophie.
So I hope that helps.
Donc, j'espère que ça aide. Une dernière question. On va avoir 5 minutes quand même pour souffler avant de... Ouais.
Dans le document, l'histoire religieuse des Afro-Américains. Et
The mythology was just before we received the crystal in the...
Oh, yes, pneumatology preceding Christology. Yes, yes.
j'aimerais bien comprendre comment on articule cela, cette présidence avant cette crise, dans le coup de plus quand même bâti plus sur la figure du Christ,
We talk
centré
more
sur lui.
about Christology and not
Yeah.
too much on pneumatology. How both are linked.
Yeah. And this is why we should read the African American tradition, because it's not creedal based.
C'est pour ça qu'il est important de partir de la tradition africaine américaine qui n'est pas d'abord construite sur la foi ou sur le credo.
Yeah. It's sort of like when you read the book of Acts.
De la même manière que quand on lit le livre des Actes,
We should not read the book of Acts through a historian's optic.
on ne peut pas le lire comme avec une perspective historique.
We should read it more like Geschichte. Geschichte.
Ah, des Geschichte. Ah, ouais. On doit plutôt le lire comme une histoire, c'est-à-dire la grande histoire. En allemand, il y a deux mots pour histoire. Il y a Geschichte et Historie. So, le Geschichte, c'est mort dans les faits qui se déroulent, dans ce qui arrive. Voilà. Donc, c'est dans cette perspective-là qu'il faut utiliser, il faut lire le livre des Actes.
For in Acts, we see the Spirit,
Dans les
the
Actes,
militant activity of the Spirit,
on voit bien les œuvres de l'Esprit,
moving in ways that Christ hasn't.
dans la même manière que le Christ aussi a fait bouger ou a fait se dérouler aussi l'histoire, la manière dont le Christ guide l'histoire.
In fact,
En effet, et dans les faits,
growing the church through a diaspora. The church in Acts grows through its
ah
own
oui, c'est
diaspora.
ça. L'Église dans les Actes grandit à partir de la diaspora.
Diaspora. Yeah.
Oui, à partir de la diaspora.
All right. And so some thinkers, like Justo Gonzalez, call the book of Acts the gospel of the Spirit.
Ouais. Et Gusto González, qui est un auteur, appelle le livre des Actes, l'évangile, ouais, c'est ça. L'évangile de l'Esprit Saint. Ouais.
Yeah. So we need to listen for that. We need to really listen
Et
for
nous,
that.
on doit
In
vraiment
African
écouter
tradition, African American tradition.
de cette manière aussi en partant de la tradition africaine-américaine.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.